The challenge of negotiating between an insular area and the United States was unique.
We engaged in a discussion on the future political status, not only for the Trust Territory, also for the Northern Marianas.
In the past, we've been colonized left and right, beginning with the Spaniards, the German, and the Japanese.
The Covenant founders agreed, native lands in native hands.
They're good poker players, and they played their cards well.
The infusion of money from the U.S. has improved the lives of the people here.
Everything north of here is the military lease. Everything south is civilian property.
Now we're finding out what sovereignty do we have.
We're dealing with the most powerful nation on earth. We should understand that relationship.
Imagine a map of the United States of America. Where on this map is the U.S. Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands? Actually, it's here in the middle of the Pacific, home to American citizens on American soil. The indigenous Chamorro people have lived in the Mariana Islands for 4,000 years. In the 1500s, Magellan landed and claimed the Mariana Islands for the Spanish. After the Spanish-American War in 1899, the Northern Mariana Islands was sold to Germany. And after World War I, the Japanese took over. Flash forward to the 1940s when the Americans wrestled control of the archipelago from the Japanese, and the Allies won World War II. The Northern Marianas and the rest of Micronesia were now free from their Japanese rule. But from the Allies' perspective, Micronesia's role in global politics remained unclear. So the newly formed United Nations grouped over 2,000 islands into the Trust Territory of the Pacific Islands to be administered by the United States until the TTPI's over 100,000 inhabitants were deemed ready for self-determination.
I think people forget that there was such a thing as the Trust Territory of the Pacific Islands. After World War II ended in 1945, the population in the Northern Marianas had been reduced to 4,000 from a pre-existing of more than 10,000. That was a result of the Japanese tenure there and the severity of the war and the degree of poverty that existed within that small community of the surviving Chamorros and Carolinians.
These islands were still very, very traditional. They had been somewhat disturbed by the 30-year Japanese administration and the war, but their traditions carried right straight through. The Japanese just didn't pay attention to them.
So the trusteeship was formed in 1947, and it was handled, it's fair to say, principally by the Navy until 1961 approximately. And the Navy was well equipped in terms of money and resources, but between 1947 and 1961, very little was done. The infrastructure was collapsing. All buildings built by the Japanese, obviously had suffered damage from the war and from usage. There was virtually no economy worth the name, and their health issues were substantial.
Early on during the Trust Territory, the U.S. just neglected pretty much Micronesia. Very little funding for the hospital, the public safety. And the highest grade in Rhoda is 6th grade.
It was very depressing because there's no development. There's hardly any concrete building, only tin roof houses that were the leftovers from the military World War II facilities that we scrounged to build our houses.
The Defense Department was perfectly content to leave the situation as it was, namely with full access by defense to use the land areas in the Marianas for their purposes and to hold them permanently as a deterrent to potential aggressors in that part of the world. The Interior Department was very jealous about the fact that the Navy had been given responsibility for administration of the territory. Their principal view was that the Marianas could come into the United States system, but only as an insular area that did not have the privileges and the self-governance afforded to American Samoa, the Virgin Islands, and to Guam. In other words, it had to come in at the lowest possible level which would basically mean an organic act by the Congress that would dictate everything from the garbage collection to Supreme Court appointments in the future government of the Northern Mariana Islands.
This was not what the United Nations had in mind when it created the TTPI. In fact, according to the UN Charter, the purpose of trusteeship was to promote the political, economic, social, and educational advancement of the inhabitants of the trust territories. As administrator, the U.S. should have been supporting the TTPI's progressive development towards self-government or independence. After all, without being healthy, properly informed, and financially stable, how could the island's future government truly be determined by the freely expressed wishes of the peoples concerned?
So the Interior Department was constantly arguing with the State Department because the State Department was the third agency in this ongoing debate during this decade or more, and it had a single objective in mind: not to offend the United Nations, and it reminded Defense and Interior that under the trusteeship, it could not be terminated without the access of the people to a full range of options, including independence. Every 3 years, the UN would send a visiting mission to evaluate the extent to which the United States was fulfilling its obligations under the trusteeship agreement. And of course, in 1961, there was such a visiting commission that went back and reported at its June meeting that the United States had been deficient in providing proper education, proper infrastructure, proper health conditions. It just was very embarrassing to the government of President Kennedy, who had made a statement that he was anti-colonial and he wanted to do much better.
My country intends to be a participant and not merely an observer in the peaceful, expeditious movement of nations from the status of colonies to the partnership of equals. That continuing tide of self-determination which runs so strong has our sympathy and our support.
The U.S. is mandated to prepare Micronesia to be self-sustaining. Its economy has to be good. We have to pretty much encourage the United States to comply with its obligation.
President Kennedy tasked a team led by Anthony M. Solomon to fix the U.S. now internationally exposed failure in Micronesia.
Solomon was a businessman who had done a significant study for the White House involving Bolivia and was asked to put a group of economists and political professors to work on going out and really conducting a hard look at Micronesia. And he came back with a report that was devastating in terms of the lack of financial support, the inadequacies, education, health, the whole bit.
The now infamous Solomon Report confirmed that basic infrastructure had deteriorated across Micronesia and that TTPI funding had been squandered by the quickie functioning of a quasi-colonial bureaucracy in the Trust Territory government. Solomon recommended hiring new administrators, then investing tens of millions of dollars into the TTPI government, educational system, and economy. And despite the UN's focus on preparing the people of the Trust Territory for self-determination, the Solomon Report also openly advocated for the rapid Americanization of this United States frontier in the Pacific.
President Kennedy said, "That's it, let's go forward." It involved a massive search for money from Congress. The problem is that the Solomon Report could not be implemented because of President Kennedy's assassination. And all the documents were classified for untold reasons.
After decades of neglect, in 1964, the Johnson administration finally buckled under pressure from the UN and established a locally elected government for the TTPI. The Congress of Micronesia mirrored the United States bicameral legislature. The House and the Senate were composed of elected representatives from each of the 6 districts of the TTPI: Chuuk, the Marshall Islands, Ponape, the Northern Mariana Islands, Palau, and Yap. There had been smaller district legislatures before, but their decisions could be vetoed by U.S. supervisors. The Congress of Micronesia enabled the people of the Trust Territory of the Pacific Islands to finally build their own government on their own terms. There was just one problem. A group of rebellious NMI representatives announced that they didn't want to be part of any Micronesian government. They wanted to unite the Marianas Archipelago under the U.S. flag by reintegrating with Guam.